Sorry. Just a couple of questions. Thanks very much for the presentations. I want to ask either of the speakers from NESC, I don't mind whoever answers this, about the question of just transition and your description of it to ensure that transitions are equitable and participative in both the process and the outcome at national, regional and local levels. And two questions. One is, would you consider what just transition steps have been taken in relation to Bríd na Móna as fitting with that model or description that you've outlined there? And the second is, you look at a case study in Scotland which takes a national focus rather than a regional one. Have you looked at any case studies that take a focus on not just the national or the regional level, but on the industry-specific level? And again, this in the case of Bríd na Móna. Have you looked, for example, at studies that looked at the closure of the coal industry in Spain in the Ruhr Valley for a just transition model that might help us to apply it to the closure of the peat industry here? And I have a question for Kevin Anderson. Will I give it now?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Dr. Anderson, I just wanted to ask you to, if you can, just in a couple of minutes, enlarge on your work on why carbon sequestration and storage is not a good model to work on in order to achieve your targets. I think you've given us stuff on this before at this committee in the past. If you had a brief way of going into that a bit, because I think there's an important part of our climate bill is the reliance on carbon sequestration and storage going into the future.
Thank you, Deputy Smith. The first question is for NESC, is that right? Mm-hmm. Yep. So, Dr. Moore or Dr. O'Connell, would you like to come in on that? Go ahead, Dr. Moore.
I would just like to thank the Deputy for her question, and just to say that obviously there is no completed just transition anywhere, but we have done international research which have looked at experiences in Germany, in Scotland, in Canada and Australia. Just briefly, mostly in Germany, which has a lengthy experience with this. And Sinead Mercier completed the research for us, and I think it highlights the complexity of just transition, how long it takes, how many levels are involved, and processes are the really significant part, the participation all the way through, as much as the outcomes that are achieved. And I think the Scottish example is really interesting because clearly, as I said, it was a national example, but because just transition is embedded not just in the work of the Commission, but it's also embedded in the legislation. And it's also part of the Articles of Association of the new State Investment Bank. So they've really kind of embedded just transition on multiple levels. In terms of looking at the Midlands, as we were doing our work, the Midlands was an ongoing project, and Ciarán Mulvey was established as the Just Transition Commissioner, and I believe he has a few reports, and the implementation of those is continuing. And I think it's really important to know that it is the context of very sensitive regions that really dictates the kind of localised, place-based response in a just transition. And so I think it would be up to Ciarán Mulvey really to talk about the Midlands, other than to say that I think that there is huge effort now to be consultative, to engage. There's an 11 million fund from government to be administered this year. There's a real response to trying to understand the community, the enterprise, the local government response there. I can hand back to Dr. O'Connell if there's anything he'd like to add.
No, I think that's fine, Deputy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Moore. Professor Anderson, on that second question, would you like to come in, please?
Okay, well, thank you, Deputy Smith, for the question. Firstly, in relation to carbon capture and storage, when it's applied to fossil fuel power stations, typically nowadays people think about that more for gas than for coal. What is really key there is that it's considered in relation to the full life cycle emissions. That means from the construction right through to things like getting the gas out of the ground and the leaks from the gas when you do that from the sites and you do that through to the transport. And if you look at the full life cycle emissions, then it's typically about 100 to 300 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent is the estimates for gas with carbon capture and storage. Now, just to give some flavour of that, a very good coal gas-fired power station without carbon capture and storage is probably about 400 grams A coal station is probably about 900 grams. But if you looked at wind offshore, indeed wind onshore, it's probably somewhere nearer 5 to 25 grams. So carbon capture and storage at full life cycle emissions, when you apply it to fossil fuels in power generation, is still far, far too high to bring emissions down in line with the Paris Agreement. So again, it may have been appropriate 20 years ago, but in 2020, it's too little, too late. That's not to say that carbon capture and storage can't be important on something like capturing the process emissions, that's the chemical emissions of carbon dioxide, from cement production, which is a significant proportion of global emissions, or indeed possibly from steel production as well. So it may have a role there, but I think it is inappropriate to be considering it for energy because we cannot get the life cycle emissions down low enough. When you apply carbon capture and storage to the combustion of biomass, or you often get this thing called BECCS, biomass energy with carbon capture and storage, and there, in theory at least, you'll be moving the CO2 from the atmosphere because you're absorbing the CO2 through photosynthesis, you're then burning the material, capturing the CO2, and in theory at least burying it underground. I mean, from an engineering point of view, this is incredibly inefficient. But overall, the concern there is that if you scale this up, you have major ecological impacts because you have to have this sort of growing of the various biomass crops, the harvesting of them, the chipping of those, the burning of those, and then the sequestration. That process is incredibly inefficient and very damaging from an ecological perspective, particularly if you start to import material from outside of your country. So in the UK, we import timber from the US to burn in our Drax power station. That has a huge set of ecological implications. So playing that out in the global models, it looks incredibly damaging from an ecological perspective. That's not to say that some of these things may have a niche role here and there, but we have to be very careful about how they would be applied. We also have to be cautious about some of the other techniques like reforestation and so forth. I'm all for forestry management and improving forestry management and for some reforestation. But again, planting trees, it seems like an easy option. But when you plant trees, you change what happens to the soils. And depending on what happens to the soils might mean you mobilize more carbon from the soils than you actually capture in the trees themselves. So afforestation can be really problematic, but forestry management may have a role to play. My concern with all of these, they're used as a substitute for ongoing fossil fuel use. So in Sweden, for instance, they're expanding Arlanda Airport with the claim they're going to plant some more trees in the north of Sweden. That's completely inappropriate. We will need some negative emission technologies or forms of sequestration to compensate for some of the ongoing emissions of methane and nitrous oxide from agriculture that we simply cannot remove from the system. Even if we all went vegan and never ate rice, which doesn't sound like a wonderful diet, but even if we did that, we will still have a lot of residual emissions from agriculture. And therefore, we do require some forms of negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal to compensate for those emissions, but not for emissions from energy, which need to be brought down to zero.